May I pass on to Patrick Johnson, Associate, Diplomacy and International Development, Booz Allen Hamilton, United States.
Yeah, thank you very much, Franz. And Linda, I also really appreciate your comments. I think they provide a very nice segue into the remarks that I'm going to be making. And also, it's just an honor to be up here on this panel with all of these very experienced and learned minds. So to complement the rest of this panel, my remarks are going to be focused on the role of public policy in shaping agricultural, and then by extension, health and nutritional outcomes. To help keep me within the allotted time, I do have a few notes with me that I'm going to reference, and I hope you don't mind. So one issue that this conference has clearly demonstrated over the past few days is the complexity of actually linking agriculture, health, and nutrition, not conceptually, but operationally. Overcoming organizational or ministerial silos is difficult to say the least, but this is the role of public policy as I see it. Now, yesterday it was mentioned, actually by somebody in this room, that development has a short memory, and the same can be said of policymakers. We need to learn from our mistakes and successes to understand what works and what doesn't work. In other sessions this week, we've also learned about the negative impacts of unintended consequences, whether that be in investing in economically valuable big fish versus nutritionally rich little fish, focusing on food safety at the soil level while losing sight of it of food safety and storage, or any number of other examples. These unintended consequences should also be viewed as public policy challenges and are a key component of what I'm going to be saying. So in this context, I think it's beneficial by focusing on the simple relationship between policy and outcome. Now, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, agricultural policies can be designed to have any number of desired outcomes. And governments typically adopt agricultural policies to enable some combination of food security or low food prices at home or access or benefit to farmers. It might be to maximize the export value of crops or to more efficiently manage or optimize resource and environmental constraints. And oftentimes these objectives are competing and require prioritization based on local needs, constraints, and market conditions. So in establishing agricultural policies, it's obviously important to consider your starting point and your stakeholders, those who should benefit from a given policy. These two areas vary greatly based on the country and circumstance. For instance, as we learned earlier today in the ministerial session, in Rwanda, current policies are focused first and foremost on enabling food security, as it really should be. This is a very important issue. But my remarks here aren't really focused on what we can learn from Rwanda, but rather what we can learn from the United States. And in the United States, during the Nixon administration in the 1970s, early 1970s, a conscious decision was made to pursue a cheap food policy to benefit American consumers. Now, previously, the USDA had helped maintain farm incomes and provide for farmers by limiting production. In other words, some farmers were paid not to farm. With less supply on the market, prices remained naturally higher. However, under President Nixon's agriculture secretary, this policy was reversed. Now farmers would be subsidized, given direct payments, price supports to encourage more production. The entire goal was to grow more food and to pay less for it in the supermarket. Now, this mandate played out as a get big or get out strategy, and it led in agriculture to productivity gains from increased consolidation and specialization, and farmers responded to the incentives by growing more food. With increased output, prices fell. By pursuing cheap food, U.S. farm policies objectively achieved their desired outcome. As Linda had mentioned, food prices have fallen, and in America, we now spend under 10% of income on food. That's less than anywhere else in the world, but in parallel, U.S. farm policy also contributed to a number of new and unexpected consequences. While the percent that we've spent on food has fallen by more than half, the amount of income we've spent on healthcare has more than tripled, from around 5% in 1960 to around 16% today. Now, much of this increase is tied to dietary disease. In the U.S., like many other OECD countries and rich countries, approximately 2/3 of the country is overweight or obese, and this number is rising. On that note, I do want to make a point. A lot has been said at this conference about the role of overnourishment. I fundamentally have an issue with this term to describe the situation. I see it less as overnourishment, and in the U.S. I think it's more a case of being overfed but undernourished, because when you look at the products that are contributing to these dietary diseases, it's not really the nutritious ones. Also, another way to understand this in the American context is that a lot of people rightly remark that putting on weight is just a factor of being a developed country and getting richer. And it holds across pretty much all areas of the globe. That's true, but it's interesting to look at when Americans move abroad, they universally lose weight, while foreigners immigrate to the United States, they basically universally gain weight. So looking at the dietary diseases that are plaguing the country right now, it's amazing to recognize that approximately the same amount of money is spent treating obesity, diabetes, and hypertension as is spent on national defense, some $500 billion annually. It's not millions, billions. Now, also as Linda mentioned, I do want to be careful in noting that there's not a one-to-one relationship between farm policies and health outcomes, but there is a fairly clear connection between what we grow, what we eat, and the impact this has on our nutrition and health. Obviously, dietary disease is an output of diet, and to reference Wendell Berry, eating is an agricultural act. Now, additional challenges have also resulted in food safety. Food recalls cost the economy between 60 and 70 billion annually in the United States, as only about 1% of food is traceable from farm to fork. If and when a foodborne illness outbreak occurs, we don't know the source. You end up seeing massive food recalls because we can't trace that one bag of spinach that was infected with E. coli down to the specific grocery store or distribution plant or processing facility or farm. So we end up recalling all spinach off the market, as occurred a couple of years ago. Now, there are other challenges as well and consequences as well regarding energy, environment, economic, and trade. But given the time constraints here, I just want to focus on the points already made, although I'm happy to take questions in the other areas afterwards. So, applying the lessons that we've learned in the United States to the developing world, care must really be taken to ensure that agricultural policies align with national objectives to avoid unintended consequences. A common theme that you're going to hear from this panel is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and agricultural policies can and should be tied with national health, nutritional, environmental, economic, developmental, and political goals. However, an obvious major challenge exists in identifying what these goals are and should be. And on the subject of unintended consequences, a remark that I think a lot of the economists in the room will appreciate is really another way to look at unintended consequences is that they're really just unplanned for trade-offs. This really increases the importance of getting policies right at the outset and understanding what we're choosing between so that we end up recognizing trade-offs rather than consequences. Now, it's no surprise that many countries struggle with finding the right balance in designing and implementing policies that are tied to their specific agricultural, nutritional, health, or other developmental goals. On a lot of engagements I've recently been involved with, and I'm sure many of you have had similar experiences, in many parts of the world, such as much of Africa, agricultural output remains a legacy of colonialization. In these areas, a huge opportunity exists in modernizing agricultural systems to better benefit farmers, consumers, and the entire value chain. And effective public policy is really one of the best ways to drive the changes needed. It's not enough in and of itself, but it's also a required step in establishing the agenda that moves the system forward. So, kind of in conclusion, I want to reference a remark made by President Harry Truman back in 1946, when he mentioned that no nation is healthier, or no nation is more prosperous than their farmers, or more healthy than their children. Remembering these words, I think it's really imperative that we consider the role of public policy and also clearly identify the goals and trade-offs of public policy to support healthy children and prosperous farmers, because both are hurting really no matter where you look in the world, and certainly in the United States. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I welcome all of your comments and feedback after my colleagues finish with their remarks.
Thank you, Patrick. With that, I would like to pass on to Brad Gilmore, Chief International Analysis, Agriculture and Agri-Food, Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I have a lot of, I have very few answers, but I have a lot of questions, and so my focus will be more on issues of methods and talking about some of the questions that I have some issues with. What I will touch on is 4 theme areas: getting diagnostics right, establishing priorities and remedies based on the likelihood or frequency and severity of prospective system shocks. A few anecdotes and musings on whether and how to reduce vulnerability and rebuild resilience in our agri-food systems, as well as avoiding capture and trying to avoid the creation of new gatekeepers and bottlenecks in the system. Now, first, on the issue of getting diagnostics right and perhaps building corrective measures when we don't, that's of fundamental importance to the design and delivery of remedial measures. And I hearken back to the comment that was made earlier about we often have solutions in search of a problem, and you know, or also if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And if that's how we're going to approach ill-conceived prescriptions, may do more harm than good. So I've been very impressed by the way my veterinary and epidemiology colleagues use their tools of HACCP and risk management, structured questioning and analysis, that I think those tools have some promise, if adapted, to inform us about what kinds of regulatory or policy interventions can yield useful risk mitigation and management outcomes, and as well as deal with the nutritional and health outcomes that we are really pursuing. Now, in this current context, I think it's very important to differentiate between causes and drivers, and symptoms and consequences. And depending on their nature, frequency, and amplitude of their impact, risks are either best dealt with by either directly addressing their root causes, if you can, or the driving forces before they manifest themselves, or by dealing with their consequences ex post. If you focus on the symptoms rather than the causes or the consequences, you can often end up with quite suboptimal outcomes and wasted resources. We can discuss that later if folks are interested. As an aside, I regard the current period of price volatility to some extent. Price volatility, while very, very much of concern, it is a symptom of problems elsewhere. And if we try and deal with price volatility without thinking of the original sources of that, then we risk doing more harm than good. The next thing I'd like to talk about is some kind of priority setting, and this comes back to me having more questions than answers. And I guess we need some kind of assessment as to what the sources, the likelihood, and severity of prospective shocks to the system are, whether they are, in fact, at the primary level, or whether it's a failure in the processing value chain to retain more than 40% of what we produce. We've heard, different figures thrown around. I heard that in this country, millet, unlike rice and wheat, has a far lower retention, and yet these are crops which greater nutritional value. And how do we deal with the shortfalls in that system? Now, recent stresses in the world's agri-food complex, they've arisen as a result of a confluence of supply-side shocks, rising affluence and living standards in the emerging economies, pretty prolonged underfunding of agriculture research, and patchy or inadequate infrastructure and disruptions there too, as well as new technologies, which are good news, but they increase the linkages between food, fiber, and fuel markets, and this is a new phenomenon that's creating jitters in the world market. They also arise from income shortfalls in the currency things, which I won't get into, as well as, of course, what Linda and Patrick have both touched on, misguided policies. So, with that litany of conceivable suspects, what is the likelihood and what are the consequences of those shocks? Infectious diseases, they have one particular profile. Water scarcity is another really looming question. Infrastructure, land and soil degradation, invasive species, and of course we return to our policy-induced volatility and uncertainty. And we just have to ask ourselves, are these things that we can control, or are they things that we simply respond to? What is the nature and severity of each of the kinds of shocks that they're introduced? So Again, I'm asking questions. I have some hunches, but I'm wanting to continue this conversation. So now I would like to not necessarily have some answers, but I'd like to reflect a bit more and dig a bit deeper on possible ways of reducing vulnerability and promoting resilience in agri-food systems. For illustrative purposes, I'm just going to focus on two very small things, small areas, not small things, big issues, but limited topics. One is water resources, and one is threats to wheat production. And then I will just touch very briefly on the issue of conceivable disruptions and waste in the distribution system and the value chain. Now, with respect to water, it is an absolutely key resource to agri-food production worldwide, both in terms of staple crops and particularly in the production of high-value agri-food products. But in most countries, I would say most, water is an undervalued resource, and as a consequence, we've tended to emphasize extractive technologies and extractive mechanisms in both our research and in our application. And one has to, and as a result of this kind of emphasis or this bias, the incidence and amplitude of water-related stresses is on the rise. And so with that increase in incidence and magnitude, the importance of managing water resources is also rising. So there's both a research challenge as well as a production challenge there. And I guess it's particularly worrisome when we undervalue it, when it results in overuse and depletion and or degradation. So I guess in my own frame of thinking, I think the CGIAR group, as well as UN agencies, as well as national agencies, if we're going to avoid serious shortfalls in crop production, then some attention must be paid through policies and research to improving crops' tolerance to drought and extreme events, and by improving water governance through appropriate pricing, aligning infrastructure, institutions, entitlements, and incentive systems. And David Beckham in the front alluded to the appropriate matching of incentive systems and institutional structures earlier on today. Now, to talk about wheat, I'm just going to give a couple of examples, and I don't really want to go too far because I'm not a crop plant pathologist. But the production and yields of wheat, corn, rice, and soybeans, and most other agricultural crops are very dependent on weather-related events, extremes of temperature and precipitation. And there is much evidence, I have here some, but there's actually much evidence that the incidence, timing, and amplitude of weather events is changing. So that will change the demands on our crops. For example, for wheat, temperatures above 30 degrees for more than 8 hours can reverse vernalization and basically reverse the fruiting process within the plant. Water stresses, they can impact upon flowering, pollination, and grain filling. Excess soil moisture goes the other way. It can cause waterlogging, increasing risk of fungal infestation. So if you're talking about an increase in the frequency and the magnitude of these kind of events, then one answer is to engage in crop-related research and extension activities that are geared directly to those kinds of extremes. Now, I'm going to put my agronomist hat on, take off my economist hat, and put on my agronomist hat now. Another conceivable strategy might be to investigate something called like composite seating. And now I'll give you a for instance about what I mean by that. Now, to deal with variation in weather and agroecological conditions that do in fact impact upon plant growth, some scientists have started experimenting with what I would call a cluster seeding approach. And I know of some instances in northeast China, for example, where instead of planting just one wheat variety on a particular plot of land, they plant several wheat varieties with the same kind of gluten and protein profile, but with different agronomic characteristics, some which are more drought tolerant, some which are more flood tolerant, and some which could take different degrees of temperature stress. And by doing that, they guarantee that they have a crop, and in fact over an extended amount of time, it's still too early days to have a huge sample, but they found that they overall have average yields that are 15 to 25% higher than just going with a pure monoculture. But then that also poses a question as to whether our strong attachment to strict interpretations of product integrity can continue to hold. If it's just the processing and consumption attributes that we're concerned with, then we're okay. But if you want to maintain seed integrity for some other reason, there's another thing. So obviously for registered seed producers, you're not going to want to go to that route. But for food and feed, maybe we do want to reflect on whether that's one adjustment or adaptation that we want to make in light of the new demands on the system. I'm going to skip the next point. I guess the other thing with respect to some of the issues that both Patrick and Linda have touched on, policy design considerations. We have to ask ourselves whether, we call ourselves a high-income economy or an emerging economy, but we have to ask ourselves whether in supporting agriculture and farming, we have to ask ourselves whether we're promoting practices that are resilient from an economic, agronomic, and ecological perspective. And when production losses are incurred and compensation has been paid, and whether it's in the form of insurance or an underwriting scheme or some kind of price stabilization scheme, do we inadvertently foster complacency in the face of shocks or in the face of environmental damage? Are we inadvertently encouraging people to continue a kind of monoculture that maybe shouldn't persist over a longer period of time? If we're taking that risk that may have its roots in environmentally unsustainable practices. So are there other policies and programs that are not as sticky? Are we encouraging stickiness with respect to a tendency to keep farming the same crops? And are there other ways of risk mitigation and ensuring that farmers have that income? Finally, as I close off, sorry, holding you hostage here. There's sort of a saying, I heard somebody else, I'm going to steal and twist their thing. Gatekeepers if necessary, but not necessarily gatekeepers. And by that I mean is we don't always need a central agency to tell us or to administer their programs. Maybe they can provide guidance, maybe they can provide incentives. I don't know if you always want bureaucrats to be involved in the commercial execution of either production or consumption decisions. I'm a bureaucrat. I ask myself the question, am I omniscient? And of course the answer is yes. No. Am I benevolent? I try to be. Would I be if, subjected to temptation? I don't know. Are bureaucrats responsible on a timely basis as new situations evolve? It depends on what you've watched in terms of management by committee. So, trusting in a bureaucratic or administrative solution to something and presuming that a person like me has enough wisdom to supplant and be superior to the collective wisdom of all the producers and all the consumers in the marketplace, I think that's a pretty big assumption. So I think I should leave it there. I've opened the question. As I said, I have a lot more questions and answers, but hopefully I'll get a few fires started.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah.